Metabolism is the foundation beneath everything that we feel. I believe that much of chronic disease and dysfunction is being understood at the wrong level. Not necessarily the wrong facts, but at the wrong level. And you're going to realize that a lot of conditions that look unrelated turn out to be the same problem. In this video, I'm going to teach you why we've been getting it wrong for years. I'll be distilling years of research into just 20 minutes for you. My name is Andrew Reed. I'm the founder of MedGeeks. I trained as a physician assistant. I have a graduate degree in nutrition, have had over 100,000 patient and client visits in my career, and have taught the science of health and disease to over 10,000 clinicians. With that said, I want to start with first principles. See, look, we like to think about health and disease as a collection of organ systems, but an organ is made up of a collection of tissues, and tissues are made up of a collection of cells. We have trillions of living cells doing an extraordinary amount of work every single second. Muscle cells contract and rebuild. Immune cells identify threats, mount a response, and then stand down. Hepatocytes process nutrients and toxins. Neurons in the brain, they hold electrical gradients and they fire signals. They also build thoughts, regulate emotion, and generate motivation. And every cell has to maintain itself, repair damage, replace worn parts, and adapt to demand that changes. And none of that happens for free. A living cell is basically a pocket of order that's held against the natural tendency towards disorder. And the currency that keeps that order intact is ATP. See, every ion gradient that lets a neuron fire, every protein folded or cleared, every membrane that's patched, every immune response that begins and resolves, every heartbeat, and every act of repair has to be paid for metabolically. Remove the ability to make and use that energy, and biological organization begins to collapse. So metabolism is not one system among many. It is the process that lets every other system function. The body does not simply have metabolism, the body is metabolism, and it's organized into a human form. Mitochondria are command centers. They're not power plants, right? At the center of the network sit the mitochondria, and calling them the power plants of the cell is true, but it's incomplete. They're closer to command centers that actually live inside the cell. They read the internal and external environment through calcium flux, redox states, nutrient availability, reactive oxygen load, and molecular danger signals as well. What they read actually helps them determine what the cell can actually afford to do next. Should it grow or conserve, build or defend, repair or die? Cytochrome C is a small little protein that's found inside the mitochondria that helps shuttle electrons from complex 3 to complex 4, but its release outside of the mitochondria commits a cell to apoptosis or programmed cell death. Cardiolipin is a phospholipid that's found in the inner mitochondrial membrane that helps stabilize energy production. When it ends up outside of the mitochondria, it acts as a danger signal that activates the innate immune system, and so do mitochondrial DNA and extracellular ATP. These are just a few examples that showcase how the organelle that makes your energy is the same one that decides whether a cell builds, defends, repairs, or sacrifices themselves. Energy production and cellular decision-making are two sides of one biological process. The mechanism that nobody explains is rationing. See, the mechanism no one is talking about right now is rationing. When energy supply falls short of demand, or when spending freely would threaten the cell's stability or survival, it rarely fails in this one dramatic event. In fact, it adapts quietly. It begins rationing. It protects the functions that require for immediate survival, and it cuts the spending on the expensive processes that are not essential for the moment. Things like deep repair, growth, reproduction, complex cognition, emotional range, physical performance, immune regulation, and long-term resilience. And those expensive functions are the ones that we experience as well-being. What a person calls feeling bad is often the felt experience of a system that has stopped paying for the expensive things. Fatigue is going to be the most direct example, the most common example, right? It's the conscious experience of demand exceeding available capacity, not simply a shortage of calories. Brain fog is going to follow the same logic. The brain is about 2% of the body weight, but it burns roughly 20% of resting energy. Its neurons hold steep electrical gradients. They can't switch off between thoughts and they store almost no fuel locally. So when energy production or delivery is going to be constrained, then cognition is one of the first places that we see that strain, that we feel that strain. Mood and motivation are also affected. Producing neurotransmitters, packaging and releasing them, recycling them, restoring the membrane gradients at all cost energy. And continuously, it calculates whether an action is worth the energy that is required to perform it. What we call low drive or anhedonia can be more than somebody's attitude. It can be a nervous system that's reducing expenditure because it does not perceive that it has enough capacity, if you will, to sustain the effort safely. See, the location of the symptom tells you where the strain is being experienced, but it doesn't tell you where the deepest constraint began. The same story told in different tissues. This is why diseases that look nothing alike can share overlapping metabolic biology. The lesion is going to differ by tissue, but the substrate underneath it does not. Type 2 diabetes is diagnosed, right, through glucose measurements, but at its core, it's a disorder of energy. It's a disorder of energy handling in which the liver, muscle, fat, pancreas, they must sense, they have to store, and they have to oxidize fuel appropriately. Insulin resistance can be read in part, right, as cells becoming less willing to accept more substrate when they are already struggling to process what it has at the current moment. Alzheimer's disease, right? Alzheimer's presents as memory loss, yet cerebral glucose hypometabolism shows up on PET scans early, often long before you have plaque burden that can really explain the full clinical picture. The energy problem visible before the classic lesion accounts for why symptoms, which is why the type 3 diabetic label has stuck. Parkinson's presents with movement symptoms, but the affected neurons, they maintain long axons, manage large calcium loads, recycle dopamine, and control oxidative stress for decades. It carries one of the more reproducible findings in neurology. We have complex 1 dysfunction. In the substantia nigra and the familial genes PINK1 and Parkin govern mitochondrial quality control directly. Depression, for example, is defined through mood and behavior, and those experiences emerge from metabolically active neural and immune networks. Inflammation, insulin resistance, altered mitochondrial respiration, they keep churning up in the research. Now the condition is heterogeneous, right? So metabolic dysfunction isn't the whole story, but it's a real thread that's running through at least some forms of it. Autoimmune disease is common as well. Autoimmune disease is classified by which tissue is attacked. Yet whether an immune cell becomes inflammatory, regulatory, or exhausted is inseparable from its metabolism, from whether it runs on glycolysis or oxidative phosphorylation. Change the metabolic state of the cell and you can change what it becomes and how aggressively it drives inflammation. Different diagnosis, different organs, different symptoms. Underneath, the cells are answering the same question. Can I produce enough energy? Can I match the supply to the demand? Can I use that fuel that I have safely? Can I hold calcium redox and membrane stability? Can I repair the damage that's being generated? Can I adapt without becoming trapped in defense? Do I have reserve left for the next stressor? See, we divide these problems into specialties, but underneath it, every cell is asking one version of the same question. Can I generate, direct, and recover enough capacity to do my job while still handling whatever stress arrives? What happens when the answer is no? That's where we have the cell danger response. The cell danger response is a framework for what happens when the answer is no. It comes out of the work from Dr. Robert Naviaut from UC San Diego, and it describes the cell under threat. When a cell perceives infection, injury, toxic exposure, severe nutrient stress, its metabolism changes. Resources become redirected away from routine growth and maintenance and towards defense. Membrane behavior changes, communication changes, and the cell becomes more guarded and less willing to invest in the normal rebuilding. Now, acutely, this is protective. You want cells to interrupt ordinary life when there's a threat present, but a defense program is supposed to resolve. One way to understand chronic dysfunction is as a protective response that has outlived its usefulness. A cell or tissue still behaving as though danger is present after the original trigger has passed. This is rationing that just never got switched back off. In that state, the body isn't idle. It's actively paying for defense at the expense of growth, repair, and restoration, which means that health is not simply the absence of active disease. Returning to health is an active process that has to be financed with energy. Resolving inflammation costs energy. Rebuilding a synapse costs energy. Remodeling a tissue costs energy. Restoring hormone axis, reestablishing immune tolerance, replacing these damaged organelles, adapting to exercise, all of that costs energy. Healing is not passive. It has to be paid for. And that's why the downstream fix that we often do often disappoints. See, a medication can block a receptor, replace a hormone, suppress inflammation, remove a pathogen, lower glucose, clear a plaque, or even correct a laboratory value. Now, those interventions can be necessary and oftentimes they're life-saving, but every one of them assumes that we have a body that's capable of responding. A medication delivers a signal and the cell still has to execute the response. Nutrients supply raw material and the cell still has to transport and use them. Exercise delivers a stimulus and the tissue still has to adapt rather than merely accumulate more stress. Sleep can create the opportunity for repair, but the body still has to carry it out. The intervention is an instruction. Metabolism determines whether the system has the resources to carry out that instruction. This is why downstream treatment can move the marker without really helping or restoring the person. A value normalizes, but the fatigue, the poor recovery, and the vulnerabilities to stress, they often remain. The treatment can move the lever, but the system did not have enough capacity to translate that movement into full restoration. So see, metabolism is not one lever among many. It is the precondition that decides how strongly every other lever can move the system. Now, let's ground ourselves in the reality of the situation. A foundation is not the whole house. Strengthening it will not automatically repair every damaged room. A fracture still needs stabilization. An infection might still need an antimicrobial, but hopefully those are obvious and nothing that I'm talking about right now is referring to injury or an acute illness. And you could push back, right, with the fair objection maybe and say, isn't almost everything necessary? And true, plenty of things are necessary, but metabolism is distinctive because it is the work producing and resource allocating layer that every single living system has to operate through. It's not just one more thing that the body needs. It is the layer where every other system is paid for and where their failures eventually come due. The gut, right, is not separate from any of this. I bring this up because I know a lot of clinicians and practitioners like to start with the gut. And I don't necessarily disagree. It is one of the most powerful regulators of the metabolic and inflammatory environment that we have. The bacteria there, they ferment fiber into fuels like butyrate, and that your gut lining runs on, right? They shape absorption, inflammation, and the signals that reach every other cell. The relationship, though, runs both ways, and this is not a competing foundation. The gut, the microbiome, it's part of the same metabolic picture. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming that dysfunctional mitochondria are the origin of every single disease. I am claiming that metabolic and mitochondrial capacity, they set the threshold between a stressor and what the body can absorb and one that becomes disease. So the trigger creates the burden. The capacity, the metabolic capacity determines how long the body can contain it. Disease shows up when the burden finally exceeds what the system can compensate for. And once it does, that same capacity shapes how far the damage goes and whether the body can actually climb back out. Whatever lights the match, the fire burns through metabolism. And over time, the relationship stops being one directional. Whatever came first, the two will feed each other, and the dysfunction becomes self-perpetuating. This holds even for genetic disease, because look, a mutation sets the vulnerability. It's a risk factor, if you will. But for many conditions, the timing and the severity of that weakness correlate with the metabolic stress that the cell is under. The genome sets what could go wrong. Capacity, or the loss of it, often decides when it does. See, metabolic and mitochondrial function are the shared substrate that determines whether the body can maintain health, withstand stress, execute repair. They may not be the original cause of every known problem, but they shape how nearly every single problem is expressed, the phenotype, how much damage it creates, how completely the body can actually recover. That is why metabolism sits beneath neurology, immunology, rheumatology, cardiology, endocrinology, psychology, right? And even physical performance. Not because it replaces those systems, not because those systems don't matter. Those systems are real and they regulate metabolism as much as it regulates them. The regulation runs both ways, but the energetic dependence, that is universal. Every one of those systems shapes metabolism, and every one of them still needs metabolism to work. Now, let's start with an extreme because it's something that we can all agree on. Okay, cyanide, for example. Cyanide kills in minutes. How does it do that? By blocking complex 4 of the electron transport chain. Because without oxygen, the brain begins to die within minutes because oxidative ATP production ceases. When energy production falls, ion pumps quit, gradients collapse, calcium runs uncontrolled, membranes destabilize, and the organized process that we call life begins to end. The line between a living cell and a dead one lies in the ability to maintain order through continuous energy flux. If you remove the flux, then what do we have? What remains is just chemistry without this biological organization. Chronic disease is not cyanide poisoning, right, in slow motion. But the extreme that I'm talking about here exposes the same governing principle. Biological order holds only while cells can meet the energetic and signaling demands required to maintain it. Not death in minutes, but degradation over years. Not the absence of energy, but not quite enough of it, or not directed well enough to pay for everything that the cell is supposed to do. Without metabolism, there is no thought, no repair, no recovery. Without mitochondrial function, there is no human life. Nothing living escapes metabolism, and no sustained recovery can bypass it. Every symptom, every biological response, and every attempt at healing rests on the capacity for the cells to produce energy, spend it intelligently, and then recover from the demand. So before we argue about what to do, we have to see things correctly, right? The unrelated diagnosis, the symptoms in different organs, the markers that move while the person doesn't heal. They're different manifestations that converge on the same underlying constraint. We have to look one level deeper to see that it's the same problem, just wearing different clothes. Miss that level, and every downstream fix eventually runs into the same ceiling. So the foundation is metabolic and mitochondrial health. I hope this helps you view things a little bit differently. And if this shifted how you see your own health, then the next step is finding out where your capacity actually stands. That's why I created a free metabolic capacity assessment. It's a way to look one level down at your own system and see how much reserve you're actually working with. It's completely free. Now, last thing, if you've been diagnosed with a primary mitochondrial disease, then you should know that I take on one client every single month, pro bono, no cost, no catch. It's just a small way of giving another family the kind of careful attention that I wish that we had sooner with my daughter. Both are linked in the description below to better health with better science. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.